Mr. President, members of the BAA and guests, Laura and I are very grateful to the BAA for the opportunity to present this paper on the recent medieval glass discoveries in Westminster Abbey. The paper will be structured as follows. After this brief introduction, Laura will outline the circumstances of the finds and the process of sorting and categorisation, a fortuitous exercise in non-invasive archaeology, carried out by the Canterbury Stained Glass Studio, a daunting task. I will then discuss the most important pieces, some of those identified as what's been labelled as star finds, their likely contexts and significance for the history of the Abbey Church's medieval glazing in terms of chronology, iconography and representation. Finally, Laura will conclude the lecture by outlining the proposals for displaying the larger panels and most rewarding of the fragments in the new exhibition in the Abbey Church galleries. This is very much work in progress, so observations made by the cognoscenti gathered here will be most welcome. By way of preface, we wish to express our thanks to a number of individuals who have played, and we hope will continue to play, key roles in the project, which has been very much a collective undertaking. Susan Jenkins, curator of Westminster Abbey, kindly invited me to provide an art historical input. Christine Reynolds, assistant keeper of the Abbey monuments, and Professor Warwick Rodwell, consultant archaeologist of the Abbey, have patiently answered queries and provided material. Ptolemy Dean, surveyor of the Abbey fabric, has been a stimulating participant in discussion. So if I go to the first slide, do I just press this bottom bar? Right. Can't see it. Right. Here's an example of discussion. I would like to express my gratitude not only to Laura, but also to Leonie Seliger, head of the Canterbury Stained Glass Workshop, who I'm delighted is here this evening, and all of her staff, who have made visits to the workshop enjoyable as well as immensely informative. Professor Christopher Wilson has also been a fount of knowledge on the Abbey architecture, and our apologies to any individual who should have been acknowledged and has so far been overlooked. One last observation or note of warning before Laura takes the podium. The material you will see is neither large in size nor complete, and much of it consists of small fragments. The justification for their being the subject of an entire lecture is firstly their provenance. Any hitherto unknown elements of the fittings or furnishings that comes to light pertain to a magnificent Gothic edifice located at the heart of government for 800 years, which has served both monk and monarch and combined the functions of monastic church, coronation church, pilgrimage church and royal pantheon, and of which its glazing has left few vestiges, indeed has suffered more grievously than any other component of the fabric, are worthy of attention. Secondly, as you will see, their legibility. Unlike excavated pieces of window glass rendered opaque through being immersed in soil, these have retained their translucency. The latter factor has been a sine qua non in establishing their third contribution, their quality, likely dates, for which the exceptionally copious pre-Reformation documentation is a valuable, albeit not comprehensive, aid, and in some instances, their iconographical content and context. And now over to Laura, who, as you will see, combines the patience of Job with the eyes of a hawk. Sorry.
Hello. So as Richard has said, it's the work that the Cathedral Studios carried out on the sorting and recording of the glass finds that I'm going to focus on. But first it might be useful to go back a bit. The project arose due to the creation of the Queen's Diamond Jubilee Gallery, which is due to open in 2018. Before work on the new gallery could be started, the many objects that had accumulated over time in the gallery space needed to be cleared. Some of the objects cleared were these 13th century Grizz stained glass panels. Over the years, the panels have been repaired, rearranged, and many pieces of replacement glass inserted. And the studio was approached by the Abbey to carry out further research and conservation on them in preparation for their possible redisplay in the new gallery. So the clearing continued. The floorboards were lifted and the vaulting beneath revealed. It was discovered that the pockets created by the vaulting beneath had been filled with rubble, and this rubble also needed to be cleared. Many different types of objects were found, such as carved stone, letters, bone, newspapers, but also some stained glass fragments. Here we have a picture of some of the first finds that were coming out. It's taken by the team of archaeologists doing that initial clearing. In total, around 3,500 rubble sacks of debris were cleared. The contents of the sacks were then sorted, and the different types of objects were separated out. So this is what we received. Lots and lots of bags of glass fragments. Most of the bags had been labelled up, showing a find location which corresponded to the bays of the vaulting beneath. But where to start? We knew that the Abbey were keen to reuse some of the fragments to make a new window, and the glass of historical and artistic value needed to be separated out for possible incorporation into the new window or for display in the new gallery. And perhaps some of the missing pieces of the glass from the 13th century Grizz stained glass panels we now had in the studio may also be found. This being a very different type of project that the studio typically handles, we sought advice from the archaeologists dealing with other finds and carried out a number of test runs. This was vital for us to develop the correct methodology for handling, sorting, photographing and recording the finds. So it was discovered that the contents of the bags, it was decided that the contents of the bags would be sorted into these 5 categories. During the trials, we noticed that some of the bags, along with their find locations, were also labelled with a find date, and we felt this was important archaeological information to retain. So in total, there were 47 find locations, and with the addition of the find dates, this gave 86 groups of finds that needed to be individually sorted into the 5 agreed categories. So the sorting began. Each fragment was dusted down and allocated a category. It was then laid on a light box and photographed. There was quite a lot of unpainted fragments from plain glazing, and a lot of pieces that were too small to be useful. But also many pieces of painted glass. And here's just a selection of just some of the pieces that we selected for possible reuse in some of the for maybe exhibition or the new windows. And at the bottom of this image, you can see some of the fragments that have been selected as star finds. The large rectangular piece of unpainted blue glass at the bottom there may not look like a likely candidate for a star find, but it's actually an unused offcut of late medieval sheet glass, which really is a rare find, and also indicates that window production could have been taking place on site. We also found quite a few fragments with glazier's marks inscribed into them. Here's one example. It's a fragment of plain glazing, and we can tell that the glass was marked after it was removed from the window. If you look closely at the incision on the left, it extends beyond the point where the lead would have covered the edge of the glass. It's a bit of a mystery, really, this piece. It does look like it's perhaps some sort of working out by a glazier. Another discovery of glazier's marks was on this piece. On the reverse, you can see a sketch with measurements of a stained glass panel, which does look suspiciously like a panel belonging to the north rose window at the Abbey. And the glass for the rose window was designed in 1722 and then altered in the late 19th century by a J.L. Pearson. And it just so happens that we found this fragment with the inscription J.L. Perhaps this was written by the very same J.L. One of our hopes was to be able to reunite broken fragments. And here you can see fragments that have been selected as star finds, and many of them are incomplete, but perhaps on opening further bags of glass, we may be able to find fragments that belong together. With the fragments that had more distinctive designs, this was an easier task, and we were able to do this with these 4 15th century fragments. On them there are remnants of green coal paint, which, although not uncommon for this period, it's rare for them to survive. Often they're cleaned off. These 14th century fragments were also reunited and show evidence of large-scale heraldic glazing. This 15th century piece was immediately identified as something quite special. So it was particularly satisfying that we were able to find 7 other fragments belonging to it. But we haven't managed to find that one missing piece, which is really frustrating. I've trawled and trawled our photographic records, but I don't know, it's not there as far as I can see. So searching for the related fragments became a kind of memory test. And of course some did slip through the net. And this griffin is a good example of that. Its tail, not being so instantly recognisable as something special, had already passed through the hands of the sorters and been put into the wrong category. So perhaps the keen-eyed of you in the audience, you might be able to spot its tail. So, but with the aid of Photoshop, we were able to rectify this, remove it, and reunite it with the other fragment and put it into its correct category. So after many weeks, we finished the sorting of just under 30,000 fragments. Some were really, really tiny, and as you can see, some were reasonably large, sometimes 10 centimetres. A database has been made with details of the fragments found and their current storage location, and the image references of the 700 photographs taken. So a total of 364 fragments were selected as star finds. And so as I pass over to Richard, I'd like to show you a selection of some of my personal favourites.
Thank you, Laura. One of the joys of working for conservators is they always surprise you, even when you're doing something with them. But as Laura's shown, you've got a selection of some of the pieces which I'm going to be talking about in this section. As you said, there's only a fraction of what we might call major interest, and I would probably say from the art historical point of view, there's just a little over 100, I think, probably would come into this category. What they lack in numbers, however, is counterbalanced by what new light they shed on the glazing phases, which range from the mid-13th century to the early 16th centuries. Their state of preservation, quality of execution, and iconography. Now, the new fragments, as we might call them, fall into 3 main chronological periods. Not all of them are in these periods, but for convenience, this is how they seem to fall out. One is around 1246 to the 1280s to 1290s, and is obviously related to the building and glazing of the completed parts of Henry III's new church, i.e. the choir, transepts, and 5 easternmost nave bays. The second phase covers roughly circa 1350 to 1450, and the last circa 1500 to 20, the last obviously dealing with the westernmost nave bays and west front during John Islip's long period of office as abbot. So, and for the most part, unsurprisingly, these new pieces can be related to the successive building, or more accurately, rebuilding of the Abbey phases, of the rebuilding of the phases, which are shown on the guidebook, which is there a pointer somewhere? This.
This one, a mouse.
Oh, sorry, yeah, a mouse, yes. The slightly misleading one, the earlier part here is Henry III's church, you can see in green. Then you've got the new work down here, starting in, I'll tell you in a few minutes, in the 1370s, goes on from there. Henry VII's chapel up here. And at this stage, we're really just concerned with the Abbey church itself. So for the moment, the figures I'm going to talk about, the pieces I'm going to talk about, relate, as far as we can tell, to this part of the building in the first phase. As this illustration shows, and many will know, of course, the fenestration of the Abbey church at ground level and clerestory level, apart from the transept facade walls and the later west front, in Henry VII's chapel, comprises the same design of two lights and an oculus, with variations in size. And here's the interior. Let's deal with phase one, the 13th century, say around 1246 to 1280s and 90s. The finds include several fragments from this phase, comprising parts of figures, some of which Laura's already shown you, shields of arms and painted grisaille. Here, in this section, the focus would primarily be on the figurative pieces. This is, as many of you will know, this is what we already have. And the figural pieces, as I hope to show, will relate to those. With one exception, the pieces we have comprise drapery, which by their scale came from Historiated Windows and can be grouped with the 7 extant medallions recently conserved in Keith Barley's workshop, which you see here and in the next slide, depicting a miracle of St. Nicholas, the beheading of a male saint. The garment suggests St. Paul rather than John the Baptist, but it's not absolutely certain. The stoning of Stephen, the massacre of the innocents, the resurrection, ascension, and Pentecost, i.e. probably remains of at least 4 and probably 5 windows. The identical beaded and ruby frames and the few original heads show that all 7 were executed in the same campaign, probably by the same workshop. And this is the Pentecost and Ascension. These panels, as you can see, were originally linked, and together with the resurrection, must have come from either a Passion or Life of Christ window. If the latter, the Massacre of the Innocents panel would have been part of it. Now these panels, as I think most of you will know, can be related to the surviving accounts of the period published by Howard Colvin. In 1253, between 2 in December and 13 and 15 glaziers, as well as smiths and plumbers, were employed weekly between February and July. 3 glaziers are named: Lawrence, Edward in 1253, and William in 1272. And large quantities of both white and coloured glass were being purchased. The rate of pay was 8 pence per square foot for working coloured glass and 4 pence for white glass. Between 1264, when the accounts recommenced, and 1272, payments to glaziers and plumbers were still being made. Canvas for temporary filling of windows is also mentioned between 1253 and 1272. The chapter house only is specified in 1253. The last entry from February 1271 to February 1272 refers to certain windows to be filled with canvas in the church. In other words, at the king's death, the glazing was unfinished. And there can be no doubt that the surviving historiated panels, or fragments of them, date from this phase of the work, and their style is compatible with the 1250s. So let's see a few bits that relate to these. On the left is you can see a fragment of drapery here, and this is the first slide because if you look carefully, as Leonie Seliger pointed out, this is taken from the same cartoon as this top of this part of the figure here, but clearly by a different painter. And as we know, there's 14 or 15 employed at the time. I don't think we're going to find out which one it was. But it tells us something about glazing methods. And it's a rare example at this date to find two panels from different windows using or employing both the same cartoon, or at least part of it, because presumably the fragment on the left came from a different kind of composition to the main Pentecost scene. Also from the historiated windows are these beasts, which Laura showed you one beforehand, and again, they're the work of different painters working from the same cartoon. And you can see as a comparison here with the Beckett window, were these chaps here, up here. But the context, we don't know what these were. Now, then we come to arguing probably the two best, certainly the best of the early panels. There's quite a few bits of drapery, but here you've got on the right this absolutely lovely tonsted head and this piece of this garment of blue drapery, and I think they probably go together, as we know that in medieval glass, blue represents black in earlier medieval figurative glazing, indicating a monastic habit. So together with a head, a narrative panel or panels depicting Benedictine monks is likely. The evidence of a chapel dedicated to St. Benedict, the order's founder, in the south transept might support this hypothesis. And the chapel was this one here. This raises the question of the original location and composition of the extant historiated panels. Letherby suggested that all 7 may have been concentrated either in the south transept in the area I've just indicated, where they would have been visible from Henry III's pew at gallery level on the west side, or in the detached Lady Chapel to the east of the church, on the site of Henry VII's chapel now. If, however, the supposed St. Benedict window lit the south transept chapel dedicated to him, it is also likely that the panels depicting the martyrdom of St. Paul and the miracle of St. Nicholas were originally in one of the windows in their respective axial chapels. And the St. Nicholas one was here, and St. Paul one of these, I think it's just over here, one of these two this side. A similar argument for the original locations of the other medallions, the stoning of Stephen, the infancy or passion cycle, cannot be made, and the east windows of both transepts remain a possibility. As for their composition, vesica-shaped panels like those for St. Nicholas and the Slaughter of the Innocents are common in glazing of the third quarter of the 13th century, as in the east window of Chetwood Priory in Buckinghamshire, founded in 1245. You can see here. The thought arises as to whether, in fact, the historiated panels did not form part of the kind of windows seen in the eastern parts of Canterbury and the French cathedrals, High Gothic cathedrals, but were more like Chetwood, i.e. set in grisaille, an arrangement also found in parish churches of the period, for example, Stanton St. John and Stanton Harcourt in Oxfordshire, and West Horsley in Surrey. This, however, seems unlikely at Westminster, as the Ascension ambulatory panels were originally linked, and therefore presumably form fully coloured figurative windows, as in Canterbury here, and in the great French cathedrals of the late 12th and early 13th centuries. Letherby, indeed, claimed to have discovered fragments of mosaic grounds in such windows, but no trace of such pieces seems to exist today. Even after the historiated windows to which the extant panels of figurative fragments belonged are taken into account, that still leaves a vast array of fenestration at ground level, gallery and clerestory level, about which little or nothing is known. Sorry about the quality of the image on the right. While Letherby had nothing to say about the possible glazing of the gallery windows, no doubt having in mind the great French cathedrals such as Reims, like Westminster, a coronation church, he claimed to have found amongst the medley of fragments collected in the apse clerestory, of which more later, fragments of large crowns which he considered to be of mid-13th century date and belonged originally to these windows. Also an incomplete letter R, which he took to be from a label including the word Rex. Alas, Laura and I are talking about finds. We're now going to mention a non-find or an unfind. No traces of crowns of this period were identified by Emma Wolfrey in her excellent 2015 MA dissertation on the Act Glazing, and I'm indebted to her for a copy of this. Neither have any crown pieces of this period been identified amongst the recent finds. Two fragments of similar initials to the stem of the letter R occur amongst the recent finds, but their date and context are, however, uncertain. I'm inclined to believe they are more likely to be a 14th than 13th century date. Even though there must have been more historiated or figurative windows, especially in chapels and over altars, the substantial purchases of white glass in the accounts show that much of the glazing of this phase was non-figurative and in white glass, enlivened by touches of colour. As Laura has shown, some have survived in the form of 4 panels, 3 with borders and enlivened with coloured glass, found in the easternmost window of St Nicholas Chapel, the southeastern apsidal chapel, just shown on your extreme left, this one here. And this window, you can't see here, was obviously blocked when Henry VII's chapel was built. Now, the extent of Grizz glazing in 13th century great churches has tended to be underestimated, not least because of the predilection of 19th century restorers and antiquaries for the preservation of figurative glass. But it is evident from other great churches such as York Minster and the cathedrals of Lincoln and Salisbury, which retain or are known to have had quantities of 13th century Grizz glass. And back to these panels before conservation has done them. So this is one set of them, and this is the other set. And the bottom right is, as I think Laura showed this, one of the finds, which you can clearly see is the same design as the framing up here. As so much early Grizz has been removed from its original location, it is not always easy to reconstruct its former relationship with figurative glazing. However, in one of the early 13th century radiating chapels, St Mark, sorry about the quality of the image, but it was a very dark day, of Troyes Cathedral in France, the outer pair of lancets filled with ornamental Grizz framed the 3 central lancets with their 19th century historiated glazing, imitating the early 13th century. A similar arrangement may conceivably have occurred at Westminster, albeit with different fenestration, and might explain some at least of the Grizz in St Nicholas Chapel. The western pair of radiating chapels are lit by 3 two-lights windows. The eastern pair, i.e. including St Nicholas Chapel, have 4 windows, necessitating some modification if this was the scheme. One complete and several fragments of Grizz quarries were discovered. Laura's shown one of these, a signed one already, but by different painters, and once again you can see that. Same design, different painter. Letherby, who illustrated the same design, considered they came from the clerestory. This may be correct, although the galleries, which demanded lighting and are not discussed by Letherby, are also a strong candidate. The eastern parts of the Abbey church remained incomplete for several more years after Henry III's death, and in 1285-6, Edward I gave the prior and sacrist £200 towards the work, and in 1290 a further £64, 13 shillings and 4pence. That this may have covered glazing is perhaps indicated by 2 border fragments found recently in the vault cells. 2 border fragments, Grizz quarries and other pieces with climbing stems and naturalistic leaf form, very different from any other finds, which could well date from the early years of Edward's reign. But like so many of the fragments, their original context is unknown. To hazard a guess, and assuming the glazing programme progressed from east to west, perhaps these pieces came from a window or windows at the eastern nave bays. Wherever they were located, they represent a distinct shift away from the original glazing pattern. And yet again, you can see here, they provide an example of different hands working from the same cartoon. Turning now to phase 2, circa 1350 to 1450. The fragments of this period are few in number. but include arguably some of the most important and certainly most unexpected of all the finds. Finds which appear to relate directly neither to the contemporary records, which are not numerous, nor the fabric. Construction of the Abbey church ceased with Henry III's death, and it was not until 1376 that the foundation stone for the replacement of the last 7 west bays of Edward the Confessor's church was laid. Henry Yeaverley, the royal architect, took charge in 1387, and by the time of his death in 1400, the aisle walls and most of the arcades were complete. When Henry V died in 1422, the gallery was finished and the clerestory in progress. There can, however, have been very little scope for glazing in the church for over a century, apart from repairs or replacements of existing windows, some of which is documented. Work was, however, carried out in the period on the monastic domestic quarters. In 1375-6, John Payable glazed the Abbot's Hall. Some of his craftsmanship still existed in 1925, when Lethab's Westminster Re-Examined was published, with 2 very small drawings of a saint and the initials of Abbot Nicholas Littlington in quatrefoil tracery lights. I've made inquiries, but regrettably this glass has not survived. But a fine fragment with a curling foliate design appears to bear some relation to the patterns depicted in the drawings, and certainly could be of that period. I had to show this fragment of a woman, which also I think dates probably from the 3rd quarter of the 14th century. I felt her décolleté attire is rather surprising to find in a monastic establishment, but pity we haven't got more of her. And unfortunately the architectural context of neither is known. The other pieces from this phase date from the 15th century. The significance of the first 2 is iconographic rather than stylistic. On the left is part of a Pentecost panel, which, like its 13th century precursor, would have belonged to either a Christological cycle or a Passion window. This probably dates from around the middle of the 15th century. Insufficient to the other piece, on the right, survives for a date range to be assigned to it, so sometime in the 15th century will have to suffice. The subject matter, a halo being chewed by beasts, and they are rather splendid, well, the one you can see mostly is, points strongly to the identification of the imagery as a temptation of St. Anthony of Egypt, who died in 356. In Caxton's version of Jacobus de Voragines' Golden Legend, St. Anthony was attacked by devils, and I quote from Voragine, and anon they came in form of diverse beasts, wild and savage, and the one with the horns, the other with their teeth, and the others with their paws and ongles, and disturned, and all to rent his body. A patron saint of monks in the Middle Ages, hence perhaps his presence in the Abbey glazing, in the Golden Legend, St. Anthony enjoined monks to remain cloistered. If they converse long with seculars, they must needs lose their holiness and leave their good life. What a lesson. Several fragments comprise peacock feathers and a sun banner, which, as Laura's shown you, she recognised with a brilliant bit of detective work as part of one image. Now, the feathers occur on depictions of angels in the Middle Ages and represent the eyes identified in Ezekiel 10, verse 12. And their whole body and their backs and their hands and their wings and the wheels were full of eyes round about, even the wheels that they four had. And if we look at some comparisons here, on the left you have a cherubim from Martum, on the right, I'll come to that in a minute, in the middle the Westminster fragments, and on the right the key, obviously, to the Westminster fragments. York also sits North Street, this window of the 9 orders, and you can see here you have a banner with a blazing sun, very like this, and you can see this is from a banner because you can see the starfish as well. So I would suggest that what we're looking at here is a 9 orders window. This leaves 2 pieces of outstanding quality and hence importance from this phase, both dating from the first quarter of the 15th century. Now you saw this earlier, Leonie, Laura showed this. The first is fairly complete and very high, complete and very high quality bearded head, probably of a prophet, which Leone Seliger recognised as being so close to the heads of the series of kings in the great west window of Canterbury Cathedral, glazed between roughly 1396 and 1400, that it must have been executed by the same glazier, a craftsman of great ability and at about the same date. And here's a comparison of the two heads. Currently, Andrew Rudebeck, I'm glad to see who's here this evening, is seeking to establish that this glazier may be identified as William Burr, who between 1399 and 1404 undertook royal glazing commissions in Westminster Hall and Eltham Palace, which have not survived. Now, the common denominator linking Westminster Abbey, Westminster Hall, and Canterbury Cathedral is the architect Henry Yeaveley, who was employed in all three prior to his death in 1400. It seems likely, therefore, if you've got Yeaveley, you've also got this glazier, but not, one suspects, for a bargain price of 2 for 1. Whether or not the prophet glazier can be identified as William Burr, Leone's association of the head with the Canterbury west window is of transcendent as well as translucent significance. Conceivably, the prophet painter was based in Canterbury, but the new discovery suggests that London/Westminster is more likely. While the capital obviously was a major centre of glazing activity from at least the 13th century, and the Glaziers Company of the city was in existence in 1328, the dearth of any surviving glass, major glass, prior to the early 15th century, which can be linked with London craftsmen, has negated any assessment of their contribution. As a consequence, the study of glazing around 1400 has largely focused on Thomas Glazier of Oxford, some of whose work survives at New College and at Winchester Cathedral and College, and John Thornton of York and Coventry. York Minster, East Window, is obviously his major work, as the leading exponents of the international Gothic style in the medium of glass. The prophet head and the next piece to be considered are thus provide key evidence that the London Westminster glaziers were in the van of glazing developments at the beginning of the 15th century. And this is, that was just to show the west window of Canterbury, and it's this row of kings up here. And this very sensitively drawn, as we can see, head of the Virgin, which by her mournful expression formed part of a crucifixion scene, which is still in the international Gothic mode, but probably slightly later in date than the prophet, perhaps around 1420 to 1430. It is the work of a different painter from the prophet head, but one just as highly accomplished. If the suggested date span is correct, the head could date from 1426 to 7, when John Prout, subsequently King's Glazier, is documented as working at the Abbey, as he was again in 1444 to 5 and 1449 to 50, and whose workshop was in Westminster. This, however, is no more than speculation at this stage and requires careful comparison with Proud's only surviving known commission, the glazing of the Beauchamp Chapel at Warwick, and that was from the 1440s. Another possible candidate is John Seeley, described as a servant of the Abbey, who in 1434 was granted a rent-free property, a suit of livery and an annual corrody in return for work as glazier to the sacrist. The other obvious question which arises is the locations of the two pieces. The demolition and replacement of the 7 western bays of Edward the Confessor's Church, on which more shortly, commenced in 1376, but proceeded in fits and starts, and from the accounts was insufficiently advanced for any glazing to be done there prior to the 1460s. Reglazing in the eastern parts of the church is a possibility. Also windows in the claustral buildings, but further investigation is required. And that brings us to phase 3, the abbacy of John Islip, abbot between 1500 and 1532, and I'm going to be talking about the first 20 years, 2 decades of his period of office. But I have to set the out this, you'll see in a minute. After the highlights of the previous period, the fragments of the last phase do not exactly set the pulses racing, as you'll see in a minute. Nevertheless, they have value, not least from the point of view of technique and the resulting visual impact. By their technical affinities with glazing now displaced, they appear to have come from the 7 western bays, known as the new work, which had intermittently been in progress since the 1370s, and was virtually completed, including the glazing, in the first 20 years of John Islip's energetic 32-year reign. In common with his 2 immediate predecessors, Islip took on the offices of sacrist and warden of the new works, and there can be no doubt that his oversight of building work was direct and close. Now I'm going to say a little bit more about this is just what he did in terms of building operations during his early years of office. You've got the building and glazing of the Henry VII Chapel, completion of the Western Bays, rebuilding the Chancel of St Margaret's, Westminster in the Lee, and construction of his own Chantry Chapel. That's quite apart from all his other activities. And here is his Chantry Chapel with, on the right, the quarries that we know filled it. This is one in the Burrell collection. Another one now in the chapel was purchased from the same dealer as the Burrell one, but they're not entirely certain they came from the Abbey church itself, because the Abbey had many manorial properties as well, and that's might have been the source. Also, the 2 designs, this one and the one in Westminster Abbey now, are not quite the same. I was going to quickly say, Henry, under Islip, he was very busy, because at the other end of the building, from the new works, is the building by Henry VII of the great chapel there in blue at the top, foundation stone of which was laid in 1503 and probably glazed by 1511. And the glazing, like the chapel itself, was, as Henry declared, of a grandeur and quality which met the criterion that it should be as to a king's worth appertaineth. The glazier was almost certainly the Flemish-born Barnard Flower, and comprised the typological cycle which subsequently provided the model for King's College Chapel, Cambridge. Regrettably, what little survived, the Reformation and Commonwealth, was almost totally lost during the Second World War. Photographs from some quarries, however, demonstrate Henry's personal stamp, projecting the legitimacy and permanency of a new dynasty at the heart of royal governance. Unfortunately, none of the recent finds appears to come from the chapel. Although the supervision of Henry's Lady Chapel must have been in the hands of the royal administration, its glazing provides a context for Islip's campaign for the long overdue completion of the nave new work, i.e. the westernmost nave bays. This is far too long to read, so don't. This is a chart, really, of the stop and go progress from 1376 onwards. There is, I made a typing error down here, 1509 to 10, not 16, is Twig glazing the west window. Some glazing took place in 1468 to 70, but nothing more appears to have been done until a major campaign got underway in 1507 to 8, although the accounts, as I think it shows here, do not survive for 1506 to 7. In 1507 to 8, you can see 14 clerestory windows were glazed, and subsequent 1509 to 10, the Great West Window and one clerestory window by Richard Twig, who must have been the Malvern glazier summoned by the Abbey in 1505 to 6 to view the windows. Twig, we know, glazed these 6 clerestory windows in the new work up here on the north side. Previously, Twig had worked at Lord Cromwell's Collegiate Church at Tattershall, where some of his glazing survives. A number of churches in Worcestershire, Warwickshire and Gloucestershire can also be attributed to his workshop. The employment for a provincial gallery for such a prestigious building would be surprising, were it not for the fact that Malvern Priory was in effect a daughter house of the Abbey, also that it evidently had close links, the Malvern close had links with Henry VII and his court. The King, the Queen, his Queen, and the 3 knightly members of the household were represented at the base of the north transept facade window, glazed by Twig at Malvern. Because Westminster nave glazing has left so few traces and had such a lengthy time frame, it demands closer study than is perhaps justified by the recently discovered fragments if seen in isolation. And I shall cut through this. This is what we've got. There's a few more than these. On the top left, you've got part of a shield of arms with a marklet, aurora marklet on a ruby ground, and then these shapes, there's a few more than these, set against a ruby glass. The figures, these can be related to the much altered figures in the apse clerestory, which originally formed part of the western nave glazing. The figures include St. Edward the Confessor, the Abbey founder and builder of the first church, and St. John the Evangelist in the guise of a beggar, as well as canonised prelates. This is just a general by Ackerman in the apse clerestory. The comparison comes down to a common use of the same technique in garments, a technique rarely found apart from on heraldic glass, as indeed can be seen on the shield piece. In the apse clerestory, it is applied to garments worn by a canonised bishop, as you can see here, or abbot, and Edward the Confessor. These figures, which were recorded in 1708 in at the west end of the nave's south aisle, and this is what I'm looking at here. Now, hitherto, if it was desired to have garments of more than one colour, each one had to be separately leaded. As you can see here, this is Prudd's work at the Beauchamp Chapel, these jewelled figures here, and so and so. A laborious process which reduced clarity. The exception was yellow stain, the application of silver sulphide, which enhanced the translucency of windows by reducing the leaded element and permitted greater freedom of composition. And this is here, you've got yellow stain here, yellow stain around the halo as well. When applied to white glass, the silver sulphide turned yellow, and when used on blue glass, it turned green. And you can just see some of the green here on the robe of the St. John. Both separate leading for each colour and the use of yellow stain and white and blue glass are employed on this figure of St. John of Bridlington. At Westminster, a different process is used. The ruby glass, which is only a surface layer, is carefully abraded to the required design. This is from the back of it. They've cut out, in other words, the pot mellow colour. Yellow stain is applied and toned down with fired paint without the need for leading. The result is greater clarity and dexterity in design motifs. And again, going back to you can see it here on the pilgrim figure and here on this figure here. The technique does not appear to have widespread use. At least one or other occurrence at Yarnton in Oxfordshire, and I'd be pleased to hear of any more. So I showed this so it's rather clearer. You can see the motifs, which some think could be initials on these garments. Yarnton on the left, you can see the same techniques used here. And on the right, this is a fragment from Long Millford, it's more usual application when you've got heraldry, where you just braid out and put the figure in. The point, and what they're trying to do, is to replicate the sumptuous garments worn by late medieval individuals of rank, as portrayed on the right by Conrad Witz in this panel of circa 1435. The point to be made is that although far from seeking to imitate or match the fashionable expertise of the Flemish creators of the windows of Henry VII's Lady Chapel at the East End, nonetheless, through colour and translucency, colour and embellishment, the Glazers were making a monumental translucent statement, one entirely appropriate for an edifice of the status of Westminster Abbey. If it was not a case of as to a king's work appertaineth, as in Henry's bequest for the new Lady Chapel, at least it could justifiably be adapted as to a royal abbey appertaineth at the heart of Dublin. The fragments related to the apse figures show that there are once more than the 6 there now, which, as I mentioned above, are ex situ. Now we know that, well, in 1708, Christopher Hatton tells us that the Edward the Confessor was in the south aisle and with several other figures, and John Aubrey was more precise, and in 1696 he said that Edward the Confessor and John figures were in the window to the west of the door to the west cloister walk. Other early sources recorded the figures of Richard II with his White Hart device in another south aisle window, and in 1704 Edward the Black Prince in the same aisle west window, where it still remains, albeit somewhat restored, and there you can see on the left. The nave's south aisle glazing therefore includes a series of English kings and prominent princes, which for Henry VII by association could have provided a visual manifestation of continuity and legitimacy. The identities of the figures in the other clerestory lights are uncertain because of their condition. One is an apostle, and another a canonised bishop, the last a pair of male saints. Presumably they all came from somewhere in the nave. The apostle and canonised prelate perhaps belonged to a series of windows depicting saintly hierarchs and their apostolic precursors, i.e. a counterpart to the English secular rulers in the South Isle. To what extent, however, there was an iconographical blueprint that throughout the western nave bays remains an open question. The contents of the North Aisle windows are totally unknown, and the descriptions of Hattonellas are vague in the extreme elsewhere in this part of the church. That glazing was carried out in the new work in at least 2 phases, separated by more than 3 decades, militates against a unified thematic programme. Although the concentrated glazing of all the clerestory windows in 1507-08 by Richard Twigg suggests that there at least a single scheme existed. Now, comparisons, though, with surviving Westminster panels with glazing elsewhere associated with Twigg reveal no stylistic affinities. Other glaziers, therefore, were also employed on the nave, apart from those working in 1468-70. Another factor that needs to be taken into account is the first evidence to emerge to date in the Abbey's construction history of donations of windows by lay individuals below royal and aristocratic rank. In his will dated 1511, William Baynard, yeoman and brewer and parishioner of St Margaret's, Westminster, stipulated his body was to be buried within the new work, and I quote, "against whereas I made the glass window within and the said new work." His grave, therefore, was in one of the aisles, which provides a terminus antiquem for at least some of its glazing. The possibility has to be borne in mind that the imagery of Baynard's window was of his own choice and not dictated by the Abbey. Also, that its funding as a personal donation may not have appeared in the Abbey fabric rolls. Amongst the recently discovered fragments, the heraldic piece with a bird on a foliate ruby ground also possibly indicates another lay donor, albeit an omnivorous one. When Islip died in 1532, he could not have envisaged that within 8 years, the institution of which he presided for more than 3 decades would cease to exist. The huge investments in the fabric made by Henry III and Henry VII were followed by the policy of the latter's son, which led directly to the destruction both of the Abbey as an institution and almost all of its glazing. In 1540, the Abbey was dissolved. The windows suffered almost immediately. In 1547, the imperial ambassador to the region of the Netherlands noted that for the last 2 days, these images have begun to be taken down and cast away at Westminster, and they will not even leave room for the glass. In 1643-4, the damage was probably even more wholesale. A parliamentary committee ordered that the pictorial material should be removed, and in the summer and autumn of 1645, Henry VII's chapel was glazed with white glass. The collective result of both phases of destruction has been the fragments and displaced panels we see today. And Laura will finish by outlining the proposals to display the medieval glazing.
So, what to do with the fragments? It's planned that some of the 13th century Grizz panels and some of the star finds will be displayed in the new gallery. And we're currently working with Ptolemy Dean Architects and the Abbey to create 2 new windows. And these will be located in the link bridge that will give access to the new galleries. We've proposed 2 different approaches for each of the windows. The first will use the fragments sorted from the reusable category, and they will be leaded in a traditional manner. And the second will display the Grizz fragments using a technique that we've specially developed for this project. So the leaded window. Normally when you make a leaded window, you create the design and cut the glass to the correct shape. But as this is a fragment window, we're going to be, the design is going to really be dictated by the shape of the fragments. In the past, glaziers may have felt comfortable nibbling edges and trimming things to the correct size, but now conservators working to current ethical codes, that's really a no-go area. You may be obviously destroying evidence or evidence. So the window will predominantly be using fragments that are red, white and blue, and sample sections of each of these colours was made. Each fragment was temporarily labelled with a number that corresponded to its find location and date. This ensured that unused fragments can be returned to their correct storage location, and that a full archaeological record of where the fragments came from will be able to be made when the window is complete. So here we have a section of the window, the blue section, predominantly blue section. You can see that the pieces are being carefully arranged to try and minimise the gaps between each fragment, to minimise the thickness of the lead that ultimately will be positioned there. So when the arrangement was decided, a clear sheet of glass was painted with black lines to imitate the required position and required thickness of the lead. And the glass was then placed on top to give an idea of how it will look when it's leaded into the window. And this process was repeated with the white section, and finally with the red section. But this time it was leaded. So we were actually able to hold this up to the light. It was quite an exciting moment in the studio, really, being able to see light being transmitted through this glass that had been lost for so long. So this is the design that we're currently working towards. You can see the central row of diamonds. That's going to contain specially selected star finds. Of course, the background, the actual exact design will vary slightly. We're yet to sort of fully explore the possibilities of the near to 8,000 fragments that we've got to choose from. So on to the Grizz fragment window. We knew from the database that we had just under 4,000 fragments that we could possibly include, and that the window would be larger and bay-shaped. And it was agreed that the Grizz fragments should be positioned in the outer rectangular quarries, so positioned around this edge on each of the 5 openings. And to aid us with retaining the archaeological information of the fragments, it was decided that fragments from only sort of one find location and date would be positioned within each of the fragments, within each of those rectangular quarries. So drawing on inspiration from existing Grizz windows, we again started to carry out trials. We've got one of the Grizz fragment panels that we had in the studio there that was found up in the gallery space, and on the right a Grizz window from Salisbury Cathedral. Something that we really wanted to retain was the inclusion of small amounts of colour. That was very important to retain that in the new window. So here's the first trial. We used the same process with the black line on the glass to be able to give an idea of what it would look like when it's leaded. So this trial, the intention was that this window would be a leaded window. Some of the fragments, obviously over time, have become rather dark, so we inserted modern lightly tinted glass to fill the gaps between the fragments. But perhaps not the most inspiring of designs, really. This technique has been used before, and probably more successfully. the fragments all come from, well, not all, but they're of different design, and they come from a number of different windows. So really, by leading these together, we're sort of at the risk of really creating quite an arbitrary design that perhaps doesn't really make sense. So why not dispense of the lead and the insertions of the modern glass and display the found glass as a collection of fragments? We created a shallow rectangular box in clear glass and placed the fragments inside, with a view that these individual components would be leaded together to form the outer rectangular quarries of each of the window openings. This technique, however, created a very heavy design. And the problem with the idea was not purely aesthetic. Due to the varying thickness of the fragments and some being quite undulating, the interior of the box needed to be about 5 millimetres deep. So inevitably, when held vertically, some of the smaller fragments moved from their correct position. There you can see. So this movement could cause damage to some of the fragments, to the glass, and also to the painted surfaces. This is far from ideal from a conservation point of view. So it was back to the drawing board, and it was the record photography taken during the cataloguing stage that held the answer. When we were taking the photographs, we kept a small amount of space between each of the fragments, when each of the fragments was sort of being laid down flat onto the light box. And it was this lightness and space that we wanted in the window. But how to achieve that vertically without the fragments moving? So with the aid of modern technology in the form of water jet cutting, we were able to create the negative space made by the fragments in clear glass. Such shapes are uncuttable with a traditional glass cutter. So the fragments were arranged to fit within the rectangular quarry sort of size, and then holes were cut using the water jet process in a sheet of 5 millimetre thick clear glass. Each fragment was then placed in this hole and secured in with small anchor points of clear silicon. You can see here really that that's hardly visible. And then to seal in and protect the fragments, sheets of 2 millimetre thick clear glass were then secured front and back of each of the quarries. And a perimeter lead was added. So this is a very different way of using fragments within a window, and perhaps more akin to museum style of display, but one that I think is very effective in its simplicity. So I'll end this lecture on the proposed designs for the new windows for the Queen's Diamond Jubilee galleries. And I hope this lecture has given you even just a glimpse into the discovery of the lost medieval glazing of Westminster Abbey.